This is an example of a mat braided with 100% wool fiber. You can see that it is securely bound together with no obvious stitching visible. Today I'll be using t-shirt fiber to create a mat with two distinct surface looks and a finishing rim around its edge. There are no seams between the rows, only a continuous square braided feature. In a previous Ducette mat lesson, I made a length of square braid, wound it into a spiral, and sewed each row to itself until I reached the end of the cord. This resulted in a mat with the same braided features on each side, and also securely bound together. I have since discovered that I no longer have to take the extra time to complete a mat in this way. I can literally braid the braid in a spiral, increasing its size as I go around. Here is a sample of work in progress that I've taken off the Ducette. The two styles of Lucettes shown here were my inspiration to create one tool that incorporates both. Thus, a dual Lucet or Ducette was born. I'm using the longer pronged end with the thicker fiber to begin the square braid wraps using the no-turn method of lusetting. I prefer to use a loom hook or short knitting needle to help me lift the braiding loops off the prongs, especially if the fiber that I'm using is not stretchy. In this case, the t-shirt fiber is somewhat flexible, making it easier to lift. I will begin to braid from the right prong to the left. As you know, you can begin on the left and go to the right. Either sequence will work for an evenly braided cord, as long as the alternating pattern is consistent. I'm creating a square braid with these figure-8 wraps of the working fiber. I prefer to do one prong at a time in order to control the tension of the cord. I also prefer to use the no-turn method of braiding, even though the turn version is popular. I encourage any lusetter to try both ways and decide for themselves which is the best for them. I like to consider these two prong wraps, one after the other, as one row. You can see here there are now 2 rows of braiding done. A word of warning if you decide to do several wraps on one side prong only. The resultant braid will develop a bend or a kink, which is not what we want for this project, but could be useful for others. Here's an example of what I mean. I will continue to alternate prong wraps to make a total of 6 rows. This length will be enough to allow the center of the mat to be flat when the tail end is joined to the working end of the braid. I have found that it takes approximately 12 inches of fiber to make 1 inch of braid. This general rule can help you judge how much material you need for a project. So far, some of the fibers that I have Ducette braided include leather, hemp, novelty yarns, and wool in various weights, combinations, and even with beads. The thicker the fiber, the quicker the braided project can be completed. This is especially practical for a scarfless, which is a cord necklace that doubles as a scarf because of the warmth that it provides without the bulk. Once I have completed the 6 rows, I make sure that the top surface of the braid is flat and without a twist. This will make finding the side loops to join easier. Here's an example of what I mean. Those side loops marked in red will be the ones that I will be braiding with. The bottom knot loop, F, will be the first loop that I use to join one end of the braid to the other. I'm taking the tail end of the braid to the gap between the prongs, making sure that the braiding surface is flat and not twisted. I then lift this knot loop onto the right prong. This is the only time that the side loop is not linked in this way. Here's an example of what happens to the center of a mat if the side loop is taken for the initial length. There is a definite lump formed, which is not desired for the mat that I'm doing now. I will follow through with my next set of prong wraps, the right one having now 2 loops before the wrap, one from the previous row and one from the tail end just added. Lifting the loops over the wrapping can be problematic. By making sure that this wraparound is snug against the prong allows the lifting of the previous loops to be easier. I will now complete the row with the left prong wrap. Moving back to the right side, the loop that is next to use is beside the previous one linked and is positioned in line with the prong that it is to be added to. This is important as it will also ensure that the braiding will continue to be flat and not to buckle. I have found it easier to lift one loop at a time over the same wrapping, especially if the fiber is as thick as this is. Once again, I will complete the row with the left prong wrap. Returning to the right side, the next loop to be used is not in line with the prong. I have found that I must braid one complete extension row without connecting to any side loops. This will also help to keep the mat flat in much the same way one would increase chain stitches in a crochet spiral pattern. Now the side loop is in line, so I will continue to lift it up onto the prong and do my next row of braiding. When the tail end is in the way of the wrapping process, lift the work up and pull the end through to the front and underneath the braiding. I will continue to take rows of braiding by lifting up the side loops of the previous row, all the while making sure that each loop is in the proper position in relation to the prong first. If not, I braid an extension row to ensure that the mat will stay flat. As always, in this braiding the braid mat process, I work each row by doing a wrap on both prongs in sequence. The spiral effect is shown here with 2 different surface patterns. Here is a sample of a mat that is the size that I want. I'm going to finish this piece by linking each side loop in series without ever making an extension row. This will cause the last round of braiding to sit on top of the previous, creating a finishing rim as shown here. I will start braiding this rim at the place where the last extension was made. A stitch marker can be used at this point to designate the spot so that the rim row can be ended at the same place. I will not be making any attempt to check the position of the linking loop with the right prong, as I do not need to make any extending rows. Once the mat is completed, I will remove it from the tool and finish it off by putting the cutting fiber end through the prong loops in series, tightening each as I go. I will then use a crochet hook, the approximate size of the fiber, to weave the final cut end into the mat loop by loop. By pulling the end snugly each time, I can make sure that it will not come loose later. The last placement of the end should be done on the underside surface where the rim is extending upwards. Some would call this the wrong side, while the square braided surface is the right. Using a needle and thread the color of the fiber, the final bit of tail can be secured even more. Now I'm done. Here is a sample of a vessel where the rim actually consists of several rounds of no increases. A thick wool fiber was used for this cup with the intention of felting it in the future. This hat is an example of a circular mat start with mesh sides created by rows of extension braiding. Certain rows were linked in such a way as to leave gaps along each round. Both of these areas were braided with the larger pronged end of the Ducette, while the finishing rim was braided using the smaller end. This process created a tighter finishing band around the hat. This headband was braided from side to side using a similar braiding the braid process with the larger end of the Ducette for the body and the smaller end for the tightened binding row. This surface looks like the ribbing of a knitted project, while the reverse side shows a different pattern. The two ends of this braided strip could be crocheted, sewn, or braided together. I hope that this Lucet style braiding the braid no-sew mat lesson has opened up a whole new area of experimentation for you as a Lucetter. No longer are you restricted to making just cords and trims. I will continue to post examples of my discoveries, and perhaps there will be more videos like this in the future.